A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dreamspawn, Chapter 1. 1, 2, coming for you. Jane DeHaan pressed her face deep into her pillow as the orchestral dirge of her alarm clock pulled her reluctantly from vague, disquieting dreams. She blindly patted the surface of the bedside table for her wire-rimmed glasses and placed them on her face as she sat up, meticulously inspecting her pillow and bed. 4! She carefully plucked 4 long, ebony strands from the sheets. Jane threw the bedding back and slid to the floor in her favorite old-fashioned lace nightgown, the kind of nightie that reminded her of women running from monsters in graveyards, not to mention that the generous cut allowed her to briefly forget about the overabundance of flesh beneath. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser, a battered, faux Victorian beast which she slowly and carefully was refinishing. Nestled in an old tin candy box cradled in thick, acid-free, cream-colored tissue was her prized project, a Victorian funeral wreath made of her own hair. She had been working on it for more than 2 years now, saving every strand from her brush, from her pillow and her bedclothes, and painstakingly weaving them together in a simple but lovely repeating pattern. She carefully wound the new hairs into the mesh circle of painted wires along with all the others. Her project was more than 3/4 complete now, and when it was a full wreath, in perhaps another 6 months or so, she would trim it with lace and ribbon and hang it on her wall. Another perfect addition to what was shaping up into a lovely little Victorian sanctuary, at least until her mother moved them again and she was forced to start from scratch. As she wove the hairs, she hummed the broken phrases of the song she heard in her dreams the night before. Lazy smoke drifted over her dream memories of showing up at school and realizing that she was naked in front of her math class. 1, 2, coming for you. 3, 4. It was going to bug her all day trying to remember where she'd heard it before, if she had heard it before. "Jane!" her mother called from down the hallway. "Are you up yet?" "Yes, Mother," Jane replied immediately. Anything to keep her mother out of the room. The door flung open anyway, disturbing the valances and lace panels Jane had tracked around the doorway to mimic French doors. Jane's mother thrust her head into her daughter's bedroom. "Do I look okay?" she asked. Jane and her mother looked nothing alike. While Jane was curvy and short, her mother was tall and skinny, utterly flat-chested with long, bony legs and lanky wrists. Jane's hair was oil black, thick and straight, and her mother's hair was thin and mousy blonde with a sort of wild, childish curl that always made her look wind-blown and slightly disheveled. The only feature they shared in common were large, intelligent, and myopic dark eyes behind lenses of precisely identical prescriptions. Jane's mother was dressed in her usual drab polyester slacks, with one of many no-nonsense flounced blouses under a business blazer. "Why don't you wear a dress sometime?" Jane asked. "Something a little less car rental clerk and more boss lady-like. Something elegant." Jane's mother groaned. "It's freezing in the server room, and I've got to inspect the racks today. Besides, who am I going to impress? I work with programmers who use the stapler to cuff their pant legs and have to be reminded to change shirts more than once a week. They think anything that doesn't have a video game company's logo on it is elegant. Anyway, hurry up and get dressed. I'll give you a lift." The last thing Jane wanted to do was show up with her mother for her first day at Hemingway High. First impressions were everything. Just ask Jane Austen. The alternate title of Pride and Prejudice is First Impressions, after all. It's very easy to misjudge a person based on that first encounter, as Lizzie discovers about Mr. Darcy in that novel. Mr. Darcy. Sigh. Now that was the sort of man Jane wanted to meet and maybe marry. Dark, brooding, handsome, intelligent, well-mannered, and talk about elegant. Generally, she believed the fewer words a man spoke, the better. But he needed to appreciate Jane's own sharp observances, just like Mr. Darcy does with Lizzie. He must appreciate her criticisms. Carefully placing her funeral wreath back in its drawer and spreading the protective tissues over it, she closed the drawer and continued her morning routine. A breakfast of grape nuts with peaches and Earl Grey tea with lots of cream and sugar. The usual cleaning rituals, hair brushing in an awkward attempt at applying mascara with her nose practically pressed against the bathroom mirror. The makeup clumped and smeared despite her best technique. No matter. Beauty was only skin deep, and Jane was to conquer the world with keen intellect and advanced vocabulary instead. They had already moved her ahead a year in grade school. Who said that life itself wouldn't move her ahead after graduation? She lazily passed the computer on her desk and booted it up. While it was booting, she wiggled into glossy black leggings and a black lace tunic with flowing sleeves. The leggings clung to her thick legs, accentuating their girth rather than disguising it, and while the tunic covered her belly and hips fairly well, it still could not completely hide her unfashionably feminine curves. Long ago she stopped worrying what everyone else was wearing, because everywhere her mother moved the fashions changed. Belly shirts, hip huggers, preposterous little scraps of disco glitter, designed for prepubescent stick insects. Every few months, some new fashion atrocity would sweep the country like an unstoppable plague. Even if she had the approved boy-with-boobs body that the fashion magazines required, Jane still would not allow herself to fall into the trap of trend slavery. If people did not appreciate her extensive collection of Victorian mourning jewelry or her shadow-toned wardrobe of old-fashioned lace and velvet, that was their loss. She buckled her platform Mary Janes and took a moment to glance at herself in the mirror. There was no getting around that extra 15 pounds, but other than that, she was relatively satisfied. No matter what, it was still far better than the cretins at this new Institute of Lower Learning deserved. She stole onto her computer for a few minutes and opened Samagic, the posting software for her live journal, and a Lizatorian diary. The background was wallpapered with John Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott, with pink and darker pink borders. I can't believe I'm starting at yet another school today. I'll undoubtedly be surrounded by illiterate morons locked into mindless, hormone-driven male display behaviors, battling to impress 12-pound cheerleaders and prove their suitability for mating by crushing cans on their foreheads and impersonating their favorite rappers in the hallways. At least it's the beginning of the school year. She clicked Post Entry and went to her recent entries page to look it over, admiring the coloring and how it caught Waterhouse's subtle brushstrokes of gauzy salmon. Jane! I'm coming! Her mother's little Volvo rumbled like a smoker's lung as they rolled down the suburban streets. Jane had an inordinate fondness for the awful brown breadbox of a car that had faithfully followed them all across the country. Sitting in the scratchy tan seat made her feel almost grounded as she watched the bland, generic landscape roll by outside her window. Other than the occasional palm trees and the prevalence of Spanish-style architecture, they could be driving down any street, anywhere in the United States. No matter where they went, there was always a Starbucks, a McDonald's, a Barnes & Noble, a Pier 1, cookie-cutter shopping malls filled with identical merchandise and identical people. You could live your whole life in the suburbs without ever having to cope with the terrifying prospect of not knowing what to expect. The last suburb they had lived in had been just outside Seattle, when her mother worked for the evil empire, that is, Microsoft, and Jane needed the rides or else she'd have to walk in the unending rain. Jane sneered at the sunny postcard-perfect streets lined with elm and white birch. She had loved the unending rain. It reminded her that she was still connected with the divine. The sun had always felt too hostile and distant to be a proper representative of anything spiritually connected to her. Of course, now that they were in Southern California, the sun would be entirely too close. Jane shuddered at the thought of so much relentless warmth. Her mother said nothing and let the radio burble between them, a cheerful oldie station that fed everyone the fatuous lie about how much better life used to be back in the age of malt shop romance and Leave It to Beaver. Every once in a while she could persuade her mother to let her switch to a classical music station, but she had a feeling today would not be one of those times. Mom, can we change the station? Hey, I'm driving, I choose, she said, a hand raised protectively to slap Jane's fingers away if she even threatened to touch the knob. I need something upbeat. If I have to listen to that sleepy violin funeral music that you like, I'll drive us into a palm tree. Jane slouched into her seat, grumpy and silent. "Look, we're almost there." Hemingway High, a massive concrete prison with red painted steel pylons supporting the 3 stories, small windows raised high off the ground, and a domed gymnasium hunched behind the school. They probably don't even have a decent library, but I bet they have a TV in every classroom, Jane thought drearily, and 5 football teams, 50 cheerleaders, and a tennis instructor. Oh, let me jump for joy at this opportunity for liberal arts and college preparatory education. Students swarmed the steps leading up to the building's double set of weighty glass doors. Predominantly white and mind-numbingly ordinary, these kids were as generic and predictable as the franchises they patronized. Yet another bland suburban school filled with bland suburban kids. She was probably just as unlikely to find a kindred soul in the swarm of conformatory as she would be to find good raw Ethiopian and kitpho in the food court at the local mall. Jane's mother worriedly observed her daughter's disdain and mistook it for angst. "You'll do great, kiddo," she said. "You always do." "I know," Jane said, shrugging her nearly empty red backpack onto her shoulder, her lips pulled into a tight and shallow smile. After ensuring that Jane had the schedule and map that the school had mailed the week before, Jane's mother kissed her on the cheek and let her off on the school steps. "Good luck, sweetheart." Alone, always alone. Jane marched up the narrow steps, taking 2 at a time. At least it was the beginning of a school year and not the middle. She might have some hope of keeping her head down and going mercifully unnoticed. Yet already the vultures of gossip and insult were circling, swooping, screeching as probing eyes were pecking at her clothes, her hair, her glasses, her shoes. She found the office easily enough and checked in there before proceeding to her first period French class. Roving packs of young males sporting athletic jerseys, bright-colored surfwear, or that apparently unavoidable gangsta-like white rapper look, were occasionally invaded by scary young Republican types in argyle vests and polo shirts. As for the females, many wore blazers, not entirely unlike her mother's, with upturned cotton collars and demure denims. Apparently a massive backlash had occurred to the skimpy fashions of the last few years. Jane was suddenly missing the belly-bearing wannabe pop stars and virgin sluts. This new breed of preppies was far more frightening. Conservatism without imagination was downright Cromwellian. While from the outside the building looked straightforward enough, on the inside the halls wound like a laboratory test for rats, as the classroom numbers seemed to lindy-hop back and forth in a bewildering, non-sequential fashion. Where she expected the numbers to increase, they suddenly jumped by 10 or 15 without warning, indicating some other unseen passage had swallowed her class. She didn't want to appear obviously lost, as that would immediately single her out as a weak to the crushing predators. So she slumped against a concrete wall, slyly peeking into her backpack at the crumpled map. French class, 3rd floor of the prison, east end of the hall, room 370. Jane walked swiftly with her head down and hands clenched at her sides. An edge of insecurity scraped relentlessly at her insides, born out of her unfamiliarity with the territory and growing conviction that everyone around her were silently mocking her. Glossy green halls with scuffed linoleum floors elongated, nightmare-like before her, as her fellow students swarmed around her like spawning salmon. Shaky relief washed over her when she finally spotted her destination, the fabled room 370. As Jane slipped inside the classroom, she was closely followed by a little knot of girls. One blonde and one black girl stuck to a second, taller blonde girl like electrons to a nucleus, as they catwalked into room 370. Taking in their slick coifs, fresh perfume, starched preppy collars, and sculpted asses, Jane guessed that they were cheerleaders. With the prey species' instinctive understanding, Jane knew without being told that these were the big cats of the school, the top of the bullying food chain. And as with lions of the wild, Jane knew that the macho roar of the males was all show. It was the females who were the real danger. Jane slipped into a seat towards the front, while the cheerleaders settled somewhere behind her, flashing her contemptuous looks that made it clear that they had noticed her, singling her out from the rest of the wild beasts as a potential easy meal. The other students greeted the trio as if they were celebrities, and they said as if they owned the classroom. Several other blondes and assorted desperate hangers-on arranged themselves near the predatory triad. The obvious queen of the clique took out a little mirror and added just a touch of sheer pink gloss to her wide and sensuous lips. She was terrifyingly beautiful in that unreal movie star kind of way that made it impossible not to stare. Big blue eyes and slightly turned-up nose, flawless skin and shampoo-ad hair. Her body was tight and toned, just curvy enough to be sexy, but still maintaining a youthful waifishness in the long, coltish legs and flat, perfect belly. She clicked her mirror closed and glared at Jane, making some comment out of the side of her mouth that had all her acolytes giggling behind manicured hands. When the class found their seats, a youngish woman with wavy auburn hair and freckles in a drab olive suit stood at the front of the class and began to address the class in French. Bonjour, je m'appelle Madame Koenig, comment vous appelez? She held out her hand to various students who in turn said, Je m'appelle, and stated their name. Most of them struggled with the pronunciation. She turned to Jane and asked the question, comment vous appelez? Before Jane could open her mouth, the black cheerleader leaned forward, pouting her slick red lips, and said, Boo! The class snickered. That old sickening feeling knuckled Jane's stomach. Just ignore her. If she thinks it affects you, she'll keep it up. Something told Jane that this was entirely wrong-headed, that she should stand up for herself, but she didn't want to anger the teacher. Écartez, the teacher sternly demanded. Listen. She then ordered the class to only speak French and to be courteous to the other students. At least Jane knew what she was saying. Bitchy Brandy's lush, perfect lips were clearly better suited to French kissing than French pronunciation. Jane doubted the girl had understood a word the teacher said, even though this was second-year French. Encore! Jane stated with perfect enunciation, Je m'appelle Mademoiselle Jane Enchantée. The boy next to her slumped with discouragement. Jane began to feel better, buoyed by her ability to scramble first to the hilltop of the subject. 45 minutes later, after books had been distributed and notes taken, the bell shattered the relative quiet of the classroom. As the teacher gave out the homework assignment, the masses surged toward the door in a crush of spiral notebooks and nylon knapsacks. Jane stuffed the French book in her red backpack and slung it over her shoulder. But as she stalled behind the clog of students in the doorway, the boss blonde and one of her atomic acolytes broke away from the pride and slammed into Jane's back, crushing her against the students in front of her. Jane inhaled as a hard little fist bruised her kidney. Watch it, you fat creep! God! Can't you wait? The shorter blonde spat. I bet she fucks dead people, the tall blonde ventured in a loud stage whisper close to Jane's ear. She raised her voice, playing to her audience. Do you fuck dead people? Someone guffawed in the crowd. The clog began to break, and Jane slipped between bodies to escape in the hallway crush. Corpse fucker, the shorter blonde shouted. Jane kept moving until she lost them entirely, even though she had no idea where she was headed to next. History, then homeroom? She had to check, but she didn't want to get stranded somewhere that made her vulnerable to another attack too quickly after that one. The kids here were more vicious than her previous schools. That kind of bullying was far more prevalent in junior high school than in high school. Weren't they almost in college? Wasn't this kind of stuff supposed to be forgotten by now? People ought to be discarding juvenile coping tactics and instead be embracing new responsibilities in a world that would quickly grind away their almighty youth and eventually force them to pick up their own check. By the time Jane found refuge in a disused classroom to check her map and schedule, the next bell rang, trapping her on the opposite side of the history teacher's good graces. The history teacher didn't even look at her as she sat down. Instead, he leaned on the podium and lectured the class for a seemingly endless 3 minutes about being tardy to his class, and how he was going to be lax this time because it was the beginning of the school year. But boy, you'd best not try his patience in the future, because that meant you got detention or some kind of tiresome punishment, because he sure wasn't imaginative or flexible enough to come up with the proper form of encouragement to promote prompt class arrival. But even so, as you know, you should want to be there and try your hardest to be there, as promptness isn't something that should be applauded but rather taken for granted, taken as fact, and facts were what this class was all about. Half the class glanced Jane's way at some point during this droning discourse that heralded several months of brain-scraping monotony. Jane had tried so hard not to do anything that made her appear weak, and instead drew the ire of everyone in class by being late. How was she supposed to know that this Mr. Fielding was an unmitigated bore with a mustache that hung wetly on his lips like a drowned muskrat? Mon Dieu, this was hardly her fault. She resisted comparing the mustache to a millipede. The innocent millipede was far too beautiful to be sullied by such a comparison. She hoped desperately that, by the time Mr. Fielding's class had ended, everyone had forgotten what she had made them endure. But as the students plowed out of the classroom at the end of the period, she overheard a couple of them snickering. Corpse fucker. Word traveled fast. There were 500 kids at the school. Her mother had told her so. It wasn't likely she would be forgotten, once noticed. Not far from the history class, and with no mysterious numbering issues appearing between homeroom, was much easier to find. Thank goodness. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the tall blonde who called her a corpse fucker grabbed a friend's arm and whispered to her other friends who sat nearby, glancing significantly at Jane all the while. She pulled out one of those awful germ-killing breath strips and set it on her perfectly pink tongue, then twisted her lips into a smirk. The last thing Jane wanted was this bitch in her homeroom. The whispering burned her with alienation. No matter who else she might eventually encounter in that room, she could never ignore that someone at hand hated her. And somehow that hate would shadow her everywhere she went, always scratching the back of her head with long, ragged nails. She had hoped this school would be different, and that her senior year would help her break out of the usual role of brainy fat girl and be someone else. Instead, the girls continued to whisper and cover their mouths as they laughed. A variety of students crowded the dilapidated seats. A thin, curly-headed guy with bad acne hunched over his laptop in the farthest corner of the room, while a pale, rounded-eyed waif sniffled over a fantasy novel pressed close to her face, her black clarinet case on the desk. There sat a young man in a button-up cotton dress shirt, whose soft eyes and thin fingers most certainly got him beaten up on a regular basis. There, a heavy-set boy with shaggy hair, braces, and thick glasses wore an utterly unfashionable light blue nylon jacket. The black elastic ribbing at the bottom rode up far too high, drawing attention to the white, oversized shirt spilling over his waist. A deep depression burned in his brown eyes. Most of the other kids were not remarkable or interesting in any way. They hid what little character they had behind trendy outfits and identical phrases and gesticulations. Uniformity spread with Mussolini efficiency across the words, actions, and clothes of Jane's so-called peers. Jane knew better than to look for anyone with whom she might share some camaraderie. Such a thing rarely existed. When she did find it, the winds of fate tore it from her grasp. She never understood why her mother changed jobs so often. Why didn't they stay in one big city where the technology companies lived? They were happy in Washington for nearly a year. But then the bubble broke and Microsoft scythed a couple thousand jobs. Ever since, there was no solid work. She seemed to keep getting drawn into startups that promised futures but never turned a profit. They always needed a database administrator, but the instability rocked them from home to home. The big mistake had been moving to Minnesota for that one job. That winter was brutal, colder than Jane thought possible. She had never seen snow like that before, nor had she ever contended with such negative temperatures and vicious wind chill factors. The people there seemed crushed down inside themselves, like banked fires, grim and humorless, Scandinavian faces as cold as the vast and steely gray sky. By comparison, Southern California would be a walk in the park. Then, as the homeroom teacher took roll, Jane's bored gaze drifted towards a television that sat dead and unplugged on a cart with an old VCR in the far corner of the room. Why didn't that surprise her? They would probably watch foolish, romanticized Hollywood movie versions of the literary classics rather than be forced to endure the tedious task of actually reading. So typical. Jane Dahan? Here. The television screen vaguely reflected the movements of the students in its monochrome face, but Jane was sure she saw something else there, buried deep beneath the surface. 3, 4, better lock your door. Amber Dunn? Present! The tall blonde girl responded as if she were about to jump up and thank the academy. So, her name was Amber Dunn. Amber Dumb. Amber Dunce. Amber Duh. Somewhere, a faint snarl like a distant car engine. Jane swiveled her head and looked around, but could not detect where this noise was coming from. Outside? There was no window in this room. A radio? Was it possibly someone's cell phone ringing? Or maybe it was the curly-headed guy's laptop. The growl of the engine grew louder, and its source was suddenly clear. It was coming from the television. The engine revved, roaring ominously, and under that echo, a man's laugh. A deep, bellow, hollowing laugh that rippled through Jane, dread slicing her stomach lining. Then wheels peeled with an ear-splitting screech, and suddenly the glass exploded in a wash of white-hot light. A gray blizzard of thick shards sprang across the room as a thick fountain of blood geysered from the broken glass. Jane inhaled with terror and drew back, hands covering her face, but no glass or blood rained on her hands or desk. She lowered her hands, and a big jock next to her let out a brainless laugh that echoed from the bottom of his empty skull. "What's the matter, fat ass? Scared of the TV?" Jane had no idea what had just happened. The scrawny, oddly genderless teacher approached Jane's desk, lightly placing a hand on the surface. "Are you all right? Do you need to see the nurse?" Jane shook her head. The jock continued to jabber about her reaction, throwing his hands in front of his face as he imitated her previous moment's terror and then laughing at her as he leaned towards her desk. A couple of other boys mocked her with him, their own acne and greasy hair notwithstanding. Pot, kettles on the phone. The teacher did nothing to shut him up. Typical. So often the teachers thought the cruelty of students was normal and what teenagers just do to one another. She turned to the jock and spoke, words tumbling out in breathless rush. "You're going to fail English this semester, and they won't let you play whatever brainless sport you used to give you an excuse not to learn anything else. It almost happened last year, but this time you'll screw it up for sure, and your mother will drink herself into an almost permanent coma." The boy's eyes widened as his face shed its mirth. Jane smirked. She wasn't sure where the hell that came from, but it sure seemed to bloody the good time he was having at her expense. The girl seated behind her tapped her shoulder. "Oh, Jane?" When Jane didn't respond, she repeated her name. "Jane? Aren't you Jane?" The way she said the name was blistering yet mechanical, as if she was repeating the name of a convict serving time in her ward. Jane swiveled in her seat. "What?" she asked, half expecting some kind of taunt. Instead, the girl sitting behind her held up an open cell phone. She wore a blue headband that held her smooth red hair away from her knife-edged cheeks. She was as thin as a fashion model, arms nothing but pale, freckled skin shrink-wrapped onto thin, birdy bones. Her tiny wrists clattered with bangles. "Say cheese," she said. The phone clicked. Damn it. The girl had taken Jane's picture. Lord knew what she was going to do with it. She pretended she didn't care and swung back around in her seat to face the now untroubled television. The shock of her inexplicable vision still made her anxious. For some reason, this school was far worse than the others, and Jane had managed to make every bad impression possible. She needed to take the cue from her fellow geeks who buried their heads in books and computers to escape notice. The jock was now picking on the waif with this fantasy novel, making insipid comments about the title and trying to bully her into telling him what it was about. What do you care, Jane thought. You probably couldn't read the instructions on a tube of antifungal jock itch cream. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she pulled out the map and located her third period class. It was advanced chemistry. When the bell rang, the waif stuffed her book into her backpack and grabbed her clarinet, head down as she deftly cut through the other students on her way out. The heavy-set boy more or less waddled out of the room, fallen arches smashing the ridges of his loafers. Loafers. Jane ached with embarrassment for him. She herself was just a little overweight, yet she was constantly comparing herself to every other girl's body. Imagine what it was like to be as big as that guy. If there were any other taunts as she made her way to the chemistry class, she did not hear them. Her heart instead went out to every geek and his or her humiliation. The rest of the day evened out a bit, especially as she moved into the advanced classes. More geeks, less harassment. The teachers seemed to appreciate her more. The banter was a little more sophisticated, and she began to get the hang of the weird hallway thing, although it never entirely made sense to her. She walked home alone. The California heat beat down on the part in her hair, roasting her skin and making her sweat in her black nylon leggings. God! She would have to change the moment she walked through the door. She passed a 7-Eleven and a supermarket, and then turned the corner and entered her forgettable new neighborhood. As she navigated the monotonous suburban streets, the song from the dream grew in her head. She hummed, letting the tune skip and fall. 3, 4, shut the door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 1, 2, coming for you. Coming for you. But who? Okay, this has been Chapter 1 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Dreamspawn. I tried getting Chapter 2 done. I'm having some technical difficulties with my microphone. I will have this fixed by tomorrow. So tomorrow I promise there will be 2 chapters. I am so sorry I wasn't able to upload last night, but it kept messing up and I had no way to get it fixed. But starting tomorrow, I will be back to doing 2 chapters a day. I gotta say, this author is a good writer. The book is a bit wordy. She likes to throw those big words out often, but I like her style. And I'm looking forward to how she's going to be writing when Freddy is a big part of the book. And I'm curious to see how Freddy's going to be brought in. Is this Jane character the orphan from the beginning of the book whose parents were killed by Freddy? I don't know. Never read the book. This is my first time reading it with you guys, just like a lot of these books have been. Alright guys, please drop me a comment, click that like button. We're on our way to 1,200 subs. This is just mind-blowing. Thank you all. Don't forget, Friday I'm going to be doing the 750 subscriber celebration drawing. So you have until then to list one survivor from every Jason movie. That's Friday the 13th, 1 through 8, Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, Freddy vs. Jason, and Friday the 13th, the 2009 version. All I need is the first name of a survivor from each movie, and you could be entered into the drawing to win one of these rare Black Flame books. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher librarian saying, thanks for your patience, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!